Welcome to the Citizens Reporter. I'm the host and editor, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. The Citizens Reporter is brought to you weekly and is a news program of news of around the metro and looking at Maplewood and Ramsey County. So with me today is Mr. Mark Bradley, one of our regular Citizen Reporters. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here.
Thank you for having me. And I'd like to start out with something that kind of intrigued me because I caught this on the news this week and also in the papers that there's a boat that's being launched. And you'd think that boats being made for the government would be launched from our coastal areas. New Jersey is one that I've heard all the time about. But I really didn't think that when you're talking about something that is as important as one of the fastest, most efficient, and best boats that's being put out today, that you'd be looking at the middle of the Corn Belt to be this is being constructed.
Really?
And what it happens to be is the ship is named the Minneapolis St. Paul, and it is being launched out of Green Bay, Wisconsin, of all places, because they did build ships during World War II. When you take a look at some of the stories on its history. But they are still building them today. In fact, they are supplying about 25,000 jobs, they say in the article. And it's kind of intriguing to think that when you have the type of commitment and the technology, it doesn't matter where, it can be any place it can be built.
This article is in the Pioneer Press of Sunday, June 16th, talking about that the Navy has this new ship, and it is actually a combat ship. And you know, it's interesting that it's called the USS Minneapolis St. Paul. It says that the USS Minneapolis St. Paul was named by the Secretary of the, and it says go to page 7.
I've got it right here.
7B.
Of the Navy.
There you go, 7B.
And the interesting thing about it, it happens to be 57 feet long. It happens to also have a launching pad for battle. It has battle defense and 3D units on it. And the parts on it were supplied by 45 different states of the Union.
Right. And specifically, it was called the Minneapolis St. Paul to honor the commitment of Minnesota to the Navy and to the Minnesotans' years of service. So I guess it was our turn to have a ship named after a couple of our metropolitan cities.
And then, because I do like to bring out interesting things, the one that hits me the most is we have a problem, I feel, of government incapability. And what I'm trying to get at is they do not seem to do their job. And yet they kind of put the shine on everybody else. In this case, what happened is there's Globe College that's gone defunct, and it was training people, claiming to train people for positions, but the employers would not accept the kids after they had been supposedly getting their college degrees. So the fact is, the federal government's saying, hey, you still have to pay those loans because you completed a course. But the issue here seems to be the students feel like they've been defrauded because of if you complete a course and you can't get a job off of it, why do the course?
By the way, that these students, they aren't going out to hire their own attorney because, well, they can't pay their school loans, let alone hire an attorney. But that this federal case was filed in Washington by the Legal Defense Network, which covers roughly 200 Minnesota School of Business and Globe University students who testified or filed written affidavits in a Minnesota state court fraud case against the school. So in essence, this started out at the state level, but now we have a federal case filed as well.
I'm going down now to the county level, and I'm going to try to make the point here that going through the papers here, that Ramsey County originally opened 64 beds for homeless when Minneapolis was having problems finding places to fill beds in Minneapolis. St. Paul has really been having a different problem than Minneapolis is, which Minneapolis has been very vital in having a lot of business growth. And at the same time has had this, how should I say, Holter-type mentality. And when I'm talking about greater Minneapolis, not just Minneapolis itself, because of physically, some of the business growth has not been in the area of Hennepin County, but it can be in Scott and Meeker and things like that.
So you're basically saying anywhere west of the Mississippi River.
Exactly.
Okay, well there we go. That's the West Metro and Minneapolis West Metro area.
Right.
Okay.
And the fact is that what the article I had come up that kind of irritated me was initially St. Paul came up with a 64 county bed homeless shelter that was a temporary shelter to accommodate people because they didn't want them in downtown Minneapolis during Super Bowl.
Right, that's right, because of the event. That's right. So they had to relocate them from Minneapolis to St. Paul. It was only supposed to be on a temporary basis until the Super Bowl and all the events surrounding that were done.
And yet we're seeing that there's been all kinds of other facilities like the Dorothy Day Center that had been built in that same period of time that are also accommodating extra people. But the reality is there is no extra jobs in St. Paul. In fact, St. Paul's been finding it's losing more and more jobs. And yet we're building most of this housing in St. Paul to then accommodate busing people to Minneapolis and its suburbs. And it irritates the heck out of me that we're doing that. But at the same time, I came up with another article that even brings the issue even more to the head, that our county commissioner in Ramsey County, that is the same one who's okaying the 64 bed and the Dorothy Day Center and all the other stuff that has been for the poor, and does not bring any tax base and has not invigorated the city at all, is now expecting that she's supposed to get 2.5% increase on her pay.
Right, and we on a previous program on Off the Record News did an extensive report on that, actually showing the film footage from the Ramsey County Board meeting where there was little or no discussion, and that for the regular person who might have been tuning in to watch the meeting or who looked at the agenda, you wouldn't have even known that they were instituting this pay raise for themselves, because on the agenda it simply said that they were going to look at and consider the ordinance that addresses the Ramsey County commissioners' salaries. So it didn't actually say what amount they were going to raise it to or anything. And you see how they got that 2.5%, Mr. Bradley, is that they looked at their employees in Ramsey County. And so since they've decided that they're giving pay raises to the employees of Ramsey County at 2.5%, that way they could be in camaraderie with them, that they would get 2.5% raise also, and they wouldn't take any more than that. But you see what the problem is by having that type of argument and perspective on this is that their 2.5% increase is much different for them than it is if you happen to be a secretary for Ramsey County. Because let's say if your salary, your annual salary working for Ramsey County is $36,000 a year. Well, 2.5% increase, looking at that, that's not that much. But if you're already a county commissioner, already getting like $98,000 a year, and you're getting a 2.5% raise, well, now we're talking about some big change. And you see the person who's been selected by the county board to be the chair of the county board this year, they get even more because they make, well, $100,000 annually to be the chair. So imagine that. And you know, the median average income for a family in Ramsey County, you know what it is? It's around 50 to 60,000 a year.
But
And
that's
so
the average. Now,
Yes.
I wanted to make a couple of points here, so I'm grabbing it from you at this point
Yes.
because, first of all, there is no extra tax base that this is being drawn from. When you talk about all this stuff, the commissioners are supposed to be responsible. The county commissioners have to look at that when they start doling out money, even to their own employees, they have to say, we have to justify there is more in the bucket to be handed out because our taxpayers have to pick up the extra costs. And that's not 2.5%. Because if you're giving out $30,000 and $40,000, $50,000, and yet everybody's house values are going down in this part of town because you're not bringing any industry, you're not bringing any business in here, you're not bringing tax base into this part of the Twin Cities. This area actually is more accessible and cheaper to live in, and if you could sell it positively like it is, it should have a lot of industry coming into it. We don't do that. What we do is we say, this is going to be our ghetto. This is the East Side ghetto, and we're going to tear it apart just like Maplewood's doing. So that's why I'm trying to make the issue here, that on the 2.5, the commissioners didn't deserve it, and they should have been addressing first of all, we don't need any more beds in St. Paul if we didn't add a whole bunch of people working in St. Paul. We want them to go to Minneapolis. If Dorothy Day, which is a Catholic service, is carrying over 100 people, and I believe that facility is more like several hundred people, that unit there is really accommodating a lot of people that are not able to pay their fair share on the freight because of they're drawing welfare at this point. And I'm not against welfare. I'm looking at that you have to have an equitable balance. Now, if you were doing that in Edina, where the housing costs in there are astronomical, or in downtown Minneapolis, where they're building a 30-story building down there, and none of it is low-income housing in it. Oh, they will have some, but it's going to be the lousiest stuff in the corners they couldn't sell to anybody else. The real situation right now is we are creating a dual-class system.
One thing, just as to show a contrast between downtown St. Paul and downtown Minneapolis. If you haven't been down to downtown Minneapolis lately, and you haven't been on Nicollet Avenue lately, you should go there because you will find that they have music in the streets.
Yes.
They play music on Nicollet Avenue. That's what they do in Minneapolis. Now, of course, it's very pleasant. It's very nice. You're down there, let's say it's Thursday, they have the farmer's market there on Nicollet Avenue. Everybody comes out, mills around at the different, vendor stands and whatever. It's very nice. It's very pleasant to have the music in the air. But you go downtown St. Paul, it's not like that. It's very stark. It's very concrete. It's not anything at all like Minneapolis. And it's all about as you were talking about, Mr. Bradley, is that the vision on how to make that environment welcoming. It is very welcoming in Minneapolis. And yes, there's more jobs there, there's more higher end housing in downtown Minneapolis, but it's that environment that they've created that has helped to spur that on. That is not what you're finding in St. Paul.
Right.
It has to do with the environment that is created by the public policy of the elected officials. And if the elected officials are all thinking, oh, me, let me have another raise so that I can get to 100,000, so that my retirement account will be that much hefty, much more hefty. Well, that's how you end up with the situation you have here on the east side.
And then you ask the commissioners, how relevant are they in their doing their job properly? And I have then the J.D. Vang that we talked about last week. And I thought I'd point a different perspective on it.
And now this is in relation, though, to a proposed redevelopment in Maplewood, correct?
Right. It's one of two constructions that are supposed to be done in Maplewood. One is J.D. Vang, and the other one happens to be another developer. Both of them, if you do go to their internet sites, because I've looked at them right now, and you can do that too. And I would recommend you doing that. One happens to be nothing more than an office building manager group. And they're going to be getting the more expensive one, but they do not have a track record of building in Minnesota. In fact, they aren't even incorporated in Minnesota. They're incorporated in Texas. And my point here is, I don't know if the brother that does the construction in Texas has come up here already, or if he's still in Texas. But when I look at the two of them, you have to do a real comparison.
The two different companies.
The two different companies.
Because you're talking about two different projects.
Right. And I can get the other one here, and I should look up its name because I've got it here.
One of the projects is there in the Gladstone neighborhood
Right.
at the corner of Frost and English, where the Legacy Funeral Home currently resides.
And that's the J.D. Vang. And the other one happens to be MWF Properties. And that's the one that's on County Road C on White Bear Avenue.
The proposed site.
Right. And when you take a look at it, that happens to be in a watershed area. So technically, they're not supposed to build there as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and my question is, and I haven't really seen the film footage at the council meeting yet, but you know, the corner of County Road C and White Bear Avenue, there's a car wash there currently.
Right.
And so do you know, are they anticipating that that car wash is going to be part of that redevelopment site?
No, actually, they said that it's supposed to be an open land. So the
Oh, I
fact
see.
is,
So it's the land behind the car wash.
that's my whole point.
Okay.
It can't be the car wash because they're not supposed to be tearing anything down. There was no demolition costs on it. So the fact is, that's why it has to be in that watershed area. Now, when you talk about that and you take a look at Texas, you might realize that most of their stuff is done on concrete slabs, and they have wadis, which are supposed to be riverbeds that create during big rainstorms. Otherwise, they're not there. So you have a lot of flooding in Texas at those points, but otherwise, you don't have much of that. Here we have really streams and we have rugged.
Right. So you're concerned about the impacts that between the construction and the wetlands that are there. And certainly there are wetlands also, you know, on the other side of White Bear Avenue there,
Right.
because before all of that development up and down White Bear Avenue there, that was indeed areas of wetland. That's
Yep.
why you have wetlands behind the Goodwill store that's on the other side
Right.
of White Bear Avenue there, and they had to get a variance in order to build where they built because they were building into a wetland. So I think we can anticipate that with this development, if it moves forward, this housing development, if it moves forward, that they're also going to have to get some type of variances in order to build there as well, or considerations for the fact that it might be a little lower land and they have to accommodate proper footings and proper other kind of
Well, they're going to have to
treatment
have
of the water.
under-tunneling, siphoning of it, because the water flows from north to south through that land, and they're going to have some type of culvert that's created on there. But the real reality I'm looking at is, if you take a look at either one of these contractors, and that's what I wanted you to do if you take a look at the internet site, is the fact that when you pull up MWF Properties, you will only see that they are managing apartments up here. And that means that they have not done any construction up here at all. So you can't go out and take a look at any buildings they've built. Because they're only 2 years old, they should be having at least one unit that should be coming up if they're already actively constructing anything. But as I understand it, neither that one or J.B. Vang have any units that they can show. What J.B. Vang talks about and brags about in their deal, and that's the other thing I kind of made little hints on before, was the fact that they say that they have a project that they're supposed to be taking a warehouse and turning it into a school. And the other thing they were talking about was the fact that they have this multi-storied office building that they're going to be turning into apartments.
Right, and the reason, Mr. Bradley, we should explain for our viewers why this is such an important issue to discuss as to what developers or contractors are proposing certain projects within Maplewood or anywhere, is understanding their financial wherewithal.
Right.
And whether or not they have the resources to follow through on the project once they start it, and with the quality of the project. And this is the reason
And
why.
competency.
Right, and this is why we are addressing it here, is because these two projects proposed that might happen in Maplewood, these two projects are looking for tax increment financing, which means that if they didn't get that tax increment financing through the city and the City Council of Maplewood, these projects wouldn't go forward. Neither of these developers have the financial resources to do the project on their own dime or with their own collateral.
Right.
They are looking for that tax increment financing. And in order to get tax increment financing, they have to pass the but-for test, or their project has to meet the requirements that the state statute provides for, so that they can get tax increment financing. So if they wanted to build market rate housing, for instance, and there wasn't any environmental brownfield issues or contamination like we know there's going to be at the Hillcrest Golf Course site, let's say that at either the Legacy Funeral Home site there in Gladstone, or this one that's off of White Bear Avenue that we're talking about,
Right.
I'm not aware of any kind of environmental hazards there. So they don't qualify for TIF because they've got cleanup. What they're looking to do to qualify for TIF is that they're going to have below market rate housing. That's what they're constructing. And because of that, then they can ask for tax increment financing. So it's not market rate housing that they're going to build.
No. And the thing I also have to make the point is that across the street from the one in Gladstone is a unit that was a TIF sponsored program.
Right.
And this is our city of Maplewood that is acting as developer on all these things. And they have a terrible
Well,
track
as
record.
a pseudo developer, because they're not actually the real developer. I mean, certainly they're in the
But are
frosted-
these guys really the real developer
That's
too?
right.
That's the question I got to ask you.
Yes.
So who is recruiting these basically novices? They're novices. They have never even built a building. This guy has never done anything, and yet we're talking about the frost line that has to go 6 feet down. I have taken architectural drafting. I've taken classes because I was going to be an architect at one time. And my point here is that when we're talking about something like this, you'd think they'd have some understanding of NECA, which is a National Electrical Code. But the thing is, down in Texas and other areas, they don't really have to abide by it. And a lot of times they kind of wink at it.
Right. Well, you know, here's the question that I think you're addressing in an indirect way, is that obviously Minnesota has their own codes, and that any building that's being constructed has to comply with those codes. But who is doing the inspection of that TIF building that is being sponsored in part by the City of Maplewood through their TIF program? Who's doing the inspection? The inspectors through the City of Maplewood. So will the inspectors who are hired by the City of Maplewood have a different level of tolerance for a project that is being promoted and supported by the city versus the same attitude that they would have going into a building that is not supported and promoted by the city?
Right.
And I think indirectly that's your question you're posing.
Right.
We've got city inspectors inspecting city-sponsored buildings, construction.
Yeah, and also we've had problems in the past where things didn't work out the way they've evaluated properties, and the price didn't seem to work out for them, and they ended up having to market it for a third or gave it away. In one case right now, because I found out that where I thought they were going to build the new Moose Lodge was going to be down close to the Costco, that's going to be an actually apartment building down there.
Yes, right.
So where the sign says it's supposed to be, I think is one of those areas where they said was supposed to be very expensive and very tax important. So they're getting rid of two, how should I say, white elephants at the same time, because they were able to convince the people from the lodge to leave their site. And at the same time now they're going to take this very expensive land that should be turned into light rail, in my opinion. Instead, it's going to be turned into nothing more than a Moose Lodge, so you can never put light rail in there, even though the long-term plans, even the Metropolitan Council said, we're going to put light rail that's going to go all the way to Duluth. And we're going to use that Northern Pacific route. And if you're going to do that, you're not supposed, that's the one site you wouldn't be able to give away. But I think because of, they know how much they overestimated the property value.
You mean the city of Maplewood when you say they? Okay.
Yes. The city of Maplewood says, okay, well, we gave the land away. It's no longer an issue because they're already building this building on there, and we don't know if that'll even be built correctly because the fact we could take a look at the two contractors they've already been able to cut deals with. Are we going to see proper contractors building proper buildings in Maplewood? Are we going to have a lot more of these sugar shacks?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's right. Well, what's next, Mr. Bradley?
Well, I did have some other things that I could bring up, but I think we're going to be looking at some of the construction. And the one thing I did want to make a point of, because I've been looking at what Maplewood considers its important vital function is when it's looking at all these different things. And the other thing they talk about, well, we're going to build an apartment building. We're going to build something like this. And if you're going to do it, let's at least make it equal to the market around it. And I did grab a couple of ads here. One's called The Legends. And you take a look at it. There are 5-story and 4-story buildings for the different ones I'm looking at. In this case, The Legends is a 5-story building as constructed. And that means that it has the ability of having more people in a smaller area to occupy it, which would bring more tax base and also at the same time bring more revenue to offer more services. And some of those services are the thing that make it worthwhile to live in that one rather than at some Maplewood unit that the only thing we're asking them to do is build a 30-unit facility, and we will have a meeting room or a physical room. But we're not going to put both in there.
Well, and that's a good point, Mr. Bradley, in that the housing that's being developed in Maplewood, how does it compete with the housing that's been developed in other communities? This Legends of Woodbury, for instance, is a senior apartment community.
Right.
And here's a list of the amenities that they have in this complex. They have a 2-story clubhouse, a pub room with a fireplace, a community kitchen. They have an on-site beauty salon, a theater room, a fitness center. There is a guest suite available, craft and card rooms, underground heated parking, and then they have an outdoor community patio, 9-foot ceilings, an in-home washer and dryer, so you don't have to go down the hallway to get
Right.
your washing of your clothes done. They have large walk-in closets, granite kitchen counters, light cherry wood cabinetry. They are pet-friendly, and a kitchen, breakfast bar, or large center island, and you also get a patio or a balcony on select units. And this, you might say, well, gosh, that sounds like that must be pretty expensive, and how are they going to find seniors to live there? Well, believe it or not, the Legends of Woodbury is senior voucher housing.
Right.
And this is what they say here, that they go by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development housing guidelines that they have set forth here. And these guidelines are what are set by HUD, that your income, if you're a one-person household, your income must be $42,000 or less. If you're two in your family, your total income annually has to be $48,000 or less. Let's say you have three in your family. Well, then your total income for your family has to be $54,000 annually. Or if there's four of you seniors all living together as a family, well, then it would be $60,000. So you see, they have figured out that price point and the amenities.
Right.
Now, Maplewood has a new senior housing complex at the corner of Frost and English, right next to the voucher housing. And that senior complex is supposedly market rate, which means that you don't go by these guidelines at all, that if you make more than the guidelines I just talked about, well, then you would go to market rate housing like in Maplewood. And that, from what I understand, that senior housing, that market rate senior housing, does not have the same amenities that this voucher senior housing in Woodbury has. So how are they going to sell their market rate units in Maplewood?
And when you take the Tribune in its February newspaper had the Good Life paper. It comes out about twice a year, so we should be seeing coming about July or August a second one. And what it does is it compares what each of these are offering for you as somebody who's going to go into senior housing.
Right. So here, well, you won't be able to see this, but you will be able to see that it's a big spreadsheet where they've got listed all the various different senior housing options and the name of the complex and where they're located, and then the various amenities.
And it can be, they even give you the option there to tell you it's cooperative, if it's a rental, or if it happens to be a senior home that you can. So there's actually 4 different options they have that you can buy into, and the services that they're offering are, because of they have a larger units, they can offer more services. One of the most important ones, and this is the one that we're looking at for a lot of people who are getting up in age, is do they have meals? Is there housekeeping, personal care? Is transportation? And also, if there happens to be, because of some of these actually have, for people that are not getting around, they have live-in aides that will help you if you need to have physical assistance. Mm-hmm. So these are things that are into these units. And because of you have the large amount of units being constructed on site, and most of them are going for 4- and 5-story units. In fact, out where my son has his house, which is up there in Blaine, they have one that's just being constructed that is, I think, 6 stories high right now. And it's just massive. And I guess my point is, because you have so many people that are going to be in such a tight quarter area, you can offer them a lot more services. It means that if you want to go to the movies, or you want to go to a department store or a grocery store or something else, they can offer you a bus trip there, because they can have that type of unit there, because of they're going to be able to shuttle people around.
Well, and this brings something to my mind, Mr. Bradley, in that you're talking about how many of these senior community complexes, that they have a shuttle bus or some kind of transportation available weekly on a schedule, so that way if you want to hop on the shuttle, they go to the grocery store so you can get your grocery shopping done, or that there's other stops that they go to on a routine basis. And we hear, though, in other areas of government that we watch. Especially when it comes to mass transportation and public transportation, that there's this idea that somehow or other that public transportation is going to be used by seniors who no longer are driving
Right.
or no longer want to drive, either because they can't, because they've lost their license, or because they don't want to drive. And yet, that is not really very close to reality, because most seniors, if they need to go grocery shopping, do not want to be maneuvering onto public transportation trying to get their groceries on and off the bus or the light rail or whatever it is. And then, because that doesn't stop directly at where they live, then having to cart all that down the street to get to their apartment or their home.
And making your point is the Oakdale Hy-Vee is sit right next to a senior unit.
Right.
And they're able to walk right across to it. It's only a couple of feet, so.
Right, exactly. And so you've got that model like we see in Oakdale with the senior complex next to the Hy-Vee, or what we see in Woodbury where the senior complex is right next to the city center, or as we've been discussing here, the senior complexes that they have shuttles for the service of providing that transportation to their residents, to the grocery store.
Right.
That's what seniors are going to be using. Those are the models they're going to be using.
And they're going to pay more for that because of the convenience. They don't have to be forcing themselves to do any activity they don't want to do.
Right, and I cannot visualize them saying, oh no, I'm going to not do that. Instead, I'm going to walk a block and a half or 3 blocks to the bus stop or the Metro Transit or the light rail or the BRT route.
Right.
Get on there, go to the grocery store, the stop closest to the grocery store, walk another 2-3 blocks, walk all around the grocery store getting my groceries, putting it in my little hand cart, and then walking back to the stop, getting and maneuvering it onto the vehicle, and then get to the stop and then have to get back to home again.
Well,
you
that's
see,
kind of,
that is just not practical.
and that's the best example is, again, Gladstone, because you do have a grocery store, but because they got that spin around, or whatever you want to call it.
Oh, the roundabout.
The roundabout. I always like to call them well, it doesn't matter. But because of the distance they'd have to walk around and would have to fight traffic to get to the only grocery store that's even in the area, Borchards, which is looking at they may not even be in existence in another couple of years. I hope they are able to survive. I'm not looking to give them the death nail, but the fact is, it's the only thing that sells Maplewood's building there at this point. Is Borchards is still there. You do have a grocery store, not much in it, and you're paying higher prices because of it is a small grocery store, but at least it's close. But the fact is, right now, if that fails, then you've got, these people are isolated from everything. This city has not thought of anything to protect its clientele.
Right, the residents.
The residents.
Right, right. Well, now we have a couple of things that we want to finish up on. Last week we were talking about the North End work group that Mr. Bradley is a member of. And so we have some information on a survey that they shared the statistics of what people and businesses were actually looking for when it comes to visioning the future of the Maplewood Mall area. But before we get to that, we have a clip from the most recent Maplewood City Council meeting where appointed Mayor Marley Abrams makes much to do about, this great redevelopment that was occurring, that has occurred up at Birch Run, which is a strip mall right west of the Maplewood Mall. It's just right across the street from it. So let's take a look at that first clip and we'll discuss her observations on the other side.
redevelopment opportunity that I got to witness was at a place called Renew Anchored Dentures that is really kind of in the center of the Birch Run Center, that shopping center over there. It used to be, years ago, it was Gander Mountain, and now it's a spine clinic. They have medical companies there. Well, this Renewed Anchored Dentures is on the side of that building, and it is a beautiful facility. And it's really a lovely, I mean, they've got a full lab and everything in there. It was really kind of a fun ribbon cutting.
My first question is this the appropriate use of the word redevelopment? Redevelopment implies that there was something old there before that has been swept away, and now something new has been created in its stead. You know, say for instance, you have a neighborhood where you've got houses that somehow or other have become dilapidated and that they've been condemned and then they have to be torn down, and now you have a redevelopment area because something new has to spring up. But you see, this building that she's talking about is in the middle of the parking lot of the Birch Run Shopping Center. And sure, it used to be a Gander Mountain outlet store, but it has since been changed to having a different tenant. Simply having a different and new tenant in a building is not redevelopment. That just means you've got a new tenant. And so here we are, we've got, and I'm glad we've got this new business in Maplewood. Don't get me wrong, I'm very happy we do. And yet, though, what my issue is that the appointed Marley Abrams is calling this redevelopment. The fact that we've got a new business in Maplewood is redevelopment. It isn't redevelopment, it's just a new business has come to Maplewood. Welcome them as a new business and say, welcome.
And the other thing is that originally that was just supposed to be a spine center for that building. So either the spine center found that they had too much space for taking advantage of the full size of the building, or whoever owns the building decided they would subdivide it. But does it change anything as far as the tax base or anything else for us? Nothing gets changed. It really would help the owners of the building.
And your point is that it isn't redevelopment then, that you're just changing the makeup of the tenants in an existing building.
Right.
That is not redevelopment.
But if we're looking at that, then why isn't she also congratulating that they got this little car dealership that used to be the old Z-Bart building next to Taco Bell on County Road D?
Well, there you go. Now, she hasn't called that a redevelopment, has she?
No.
Because that's not on her list of approved kind of businesses. That's why.
Also, she doesn't want cars in this area. I mean,
Right.
let's not make Maplewood a destination. Let's make it a ghetto area.
So next then, we're going to finish up with our film footage of the presentation regarding the North End Work Group meetings and the North End Work Group and some of the conclusions that were arrived at. So let's take a look at our next clip.
As I mentioned before, there was a working group. Many of you have participated in that in some way, shape, or form. And it has a number of members, and it's been made up with a very good cross-section of folks. So we not only have elected and appointed officials on that working group, but there's business owners and managers, there's residents from the North End, there's property owners, and there's other agency officials.
And Mr. Bradley is one of those residents from the North End.
Right.
That's right. Now, I know that Mr. Bradley, when you were first welcomed into this group, that they had indicated that there were going to be a lot of meetings that you guys were going to be attending.
Right.
And now we've heard that there's been 5.
Right.
So is that number less than the number you were promised?
A lot less. And the fact is that half of these, they actually canceled one meeting and decided it wasn't worthwhile. And then another meeting, they forgot to send out invitations. So it was like the day before we got invitations, and by that time I'd figured that maybe they weren't going to do it that one since they canceled the month before. So I didn't make that one either. So the fact is, I haven't been able to make most of them myself.
Well, you've made 3 out of the 5.
Right.
There you go.
And it's sad.
So let's continue with his presentation.
Working with the City of Vadnais Heights. She took a new position, but in the early stages of this, for the first several months, Ling just did a bang-up job just getting out to the community. As you can see, she partnered a lot with the White Bear area and the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce to kind of spread the word and the message about the project. And to get word out, she did over 150 drop-in visits with businesses throughout the whole North End area, just saying, here's a handout, we've got this project going, if you got any questions, follow up with me. And those did turn into a number of actually ad hoc meetings for her, and we learned a lot of great things. And then she also arranged for a number of businesses to actually do roaming tables or traveling displays, where she brought sort of these little, what you might find at a typical open house, but you set it up in a vestibule or a foyer or a lunchroom or something like that in different businesses. And someone could be there just answer questions, offer handouts and things like that as well. So we did a lot of work to reach out to businesses.
So this consultant from the Vadnais Heights Business Association or outreach organization, she went and had 150 visits with businesses in Maplewood. Now, Mr. Bradley, did they ever have her give a report to the members of the working group to give them an update on these 150 meetings or stops that she had at businesses in Maplewood?
No, in fact, what intrigues me about is that when I started taking a look at the businesses that are the newest that have just been created in Maplewood, we have 3 auto dealers. 2 of them have just completed their construction. There's 2 others that were built about 4 years ago, but the newest one is actually one of the oldest ones. The Mercedes is redoing its whole parking lot, so it's spending major dollars to improve its Highway 61 facility at this point. So at the same time, they say, hey, we don't need to have input from anybody, and we're looking at cars that have no value in Maplewood. Here is
Or certainly up at the mall.
at the mall.
Because they're looking for the model to be that people can spend the day up at Maplewood Mall without using a car. I mean, that's what they
Right.
said.
They want to walk.
We played that clip last week where it's to be an area where you can walk and use your bicycle.
Right.
No cars.
No cars. And it's ironic because if you take a look at the financially engines that are driving the area, the destinations, like I said, at any time you go to the Doghouse or you go to the Myth, you see cars massively coming around there when they have concerts at those 2 locations.
Right. You know what? I think that's a great point, Mr. Bradley. Few people are going to a destination location on their bicycle, because the point of having a destination location is that you're pulling people from outside of the immediate vicinity to come into that area. And generally speaking, like say if it's a concert like you were using as an example,
Right.
they're not going to ride their bike there. But let's take a look at our next clip.
Some of the general feedback we heard from folks was, as you could understand, being a business owner, you'd like to see the idea of a bigger mix of stores, more diversity. They talked about apparel, more destinations, independent businesses. Folks even cited partnerships with Century College and other institutions nearby that could maybe have a presence in the North End. And they even talked about improved bike and pedestrian connections being important for their operations. And in some ways tied to that accessibility into the North End, we heard from some of the businesses that sometimes it's hard to get workers to the area, whether it's through transit or other modes as well.
Now let's put that up on the screen real quick. What I want to point out is that, okay, of the businesses that they got responses from, those responses did not include constructing housing
Right.
in the Maplewood Mall area and in and around the mall. You'll notice that the business outreach, this is the general feedback, and we know that the city of Maplewood so dearly wants to have housing to be constructed at the Maplewood Mall area to replace commercial buildings, because we saw that on the maps that we presented last week.
Right.
But you'll see the business, so you know that if the businesses had even said a whisper about housing, that would have been on this list. But housing is not something businesses are looking for. And when they say it's hard to get workers to the area, do we think having a bus rapid transit is going to
Oh, the
solve
bikes
that?
are going to do it. The bikes are going to do it.
Yes, but here's the problem, Mr. Bradley, is that a bus
sarcastic.
but the bus rapid transit, is that going to solve the issue? They could solve the issue today with changing the bus service they currently have to have it meet the needs of the workers who work up near the Maplewood Mall area. They have that within their control today without expending all the extra millions and millions and millions of dollars worth for that bus rapid transit.
Right. And if there was a demand for it, the Metropolitan Transit Commission would have expanded and had a more uniform
And robust bus
right.
schedule.
Yeah,
That's right.
in fact, like we said on the previous show, I lived out by on Larpenter Avenue, and they had buses that went there every hour.
Right.
Now we don't have every hour at Maplewood Mall.
Right. Let's continue.
Rate of response. I can't claim that that's going to statistically say that we can know something in particular, but it does give us a lot of really great qualitative information. So some of the highlights that we actually did learn from folks through the survey, we asked them to talk about sort of the biggest strengths and challenges in the area, what they would like to see changed, what they don't want to see changed. There definitely was, as you could imagine, a lot of concern around sort of the future of the mall and just retail in general. So that was kind of generally captured. But you can also see here in some of these comments, people again talking about green space, the walkability issues, the being able to have more housing, for example, in the area, and the importance of the role of the mall and healthcare. So these were all things that we were capturing as part of the survey.
Again, if you look at that chart there, housing and increasing housing up by the mall area is not very high on the list. If you look at this list of the biggest strengths, the biggest challenges, what they don't want to change, what they do want to change, you heard him say something about housing. And yet, you look at these lists and you try to figure out, where do you even read the word housing on here? Well, I don't know. I'm looking at it real carefully, and for the life of me, it escapes me. I don't see the word housing on this slide whatsoever, and yet he claims in his presentation it's on there.
What I find more intriguing is if we can keep looking at that slide, one of the biggest, the least biggest strengths was green space, though he said that was the biggest strength. We need to do that. The biggest strength was variety and retail options. When you take a look at don't want to change, they didn't want to have walking and bike trails. It's only 5%. It's at the very bottom. They wanted more business stores, medical services. And green space then comes in about a very poor third on it.
Right.
But
And
roadways are right next to it on the same thing. So how can you accommodate both? You can't.
right. So it just goes to show you that the statistics from their survey and the words that come out of his mouth do not match. So you have to not just only listen to what he says, you actually have to read what the slides say and look at the data. Now let's take a look at our last slide.
We also asked folks to rate how important they felt certain factors were when thinking about the future of the North End. And this was really interesting because 90% of the people felt that redevelopment of underutilized properties was extremely important or very important. And then building on parking lots was the second highest rated one. So people looked at that landscape and really felt that there was opportunity here to bring new things, new development, new uses into the north end. Nevertheless, there was really some strong comments around safe connections for pedestrians, as well as bicycles, and just beautifying the environment and creating more public gathering areas.
Now, the safe pedestrian connections involve something that they never addressed at this work group and in these results, is that for years and years and years, those seniors that live in the senior complexes to the east of the mall have been asking for a overpass or some type of safe way to walk across White Bear Avenue to get to the mall. Now, that is the type of pedestrian crossing that has been necessary and needed for over 20 years. And yet, the city blew right by that one. They even on file have a petition a few years ago of seniors asking for the city to look into that. Now, if you look at this chart, you will see that the highest and most extremely important factor is the redevelopment of underutilized property, 90%. That's what should be focused on. And you see how Maplewood wants to do the redevelopment of underutilized properties, that 90%, they want to focus on housing. But you see at the bottom that housing options in general is only 34%. Or affordable housing is 28%. So really only a third of the respondents even said housing was a factor at all, and yet 90% of them says redevelopment. That means that 60%, the other 2/3 of the 90% that think that underdeveloped properties should be better utilized, they're looking for commercial utilization, not housing utilization.
Right.
And you see, that is not the direction that Maplewood is going when they put together the plan that we showed last week.
And I, being part of those meetings, I know what they were talking about underutilized parking. It wasn't to tear up the parking lot and build something else in place of it. It was saying use that parking lot even if there isn't something in there at the time. Because of what they were really looking at is that, like in many things, like Aldrich Arena has a farmer's market and so does Oakdale, that's what they wanted to use. Part of that unused parking lot was for a farmer's market.
Right. Now, one last observation I want to make before we close out our show is that you'll notice on that chart that it talks about the enhanced transit service at 35%. Well, we showed where those numbers came in a few months ago when the preliminary numbers of the survey were coming in, and it was very, very low. So what this means to me is that all the transit supporters that were associated with Nora Slawick and her gang, that they heard that the numbers were very low. So they went on that survey and they made sure to bolster those numbers. So even despite the fact that they went on the survey, supposedly, from my theory, and boosted the numbers for the support for public transit, the BRT up at the mall, they still only got their numbers up to 28%. From the 7% or whatever it was initially. So with that observation, Mr. Bradley, I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in. Next week, we're going to cover how Maplewood City Council is treating The Myth, a destination location by the Maplewood Mall.